The fluorescent lights hummed their two-note dirge across Oak Creek Memorial's third floor, and Sarah Chen moved through the night shift like a ghost who'd learned to take a pulse. 18 months she'd been here. 18 months of keeping her head down, keeping her mouth shut, keeping the part of herself that had crawled through the Sangin Valley buried so deep that even the mirrors didn't recognize her anymore. The ward smelled like antiseptic and decay, that particular hospital perfume that tried to mask the fact that people came here to break and sometimes didn't leave whole. She preferred the night shift. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes. Fewer people asking where she was from, what she'd done before, why her hands moved like they'd already seen everything a human body could do wrong. She straightened the 4-line on room 307. Mr. Hernandez, 72, post-op day 3, vital stable. Her fingers worked the tubing with a precision that belonged in an operating theater, not a municipal hospital in Raleigh. When she applied pressure to his dressing, her touch was surgical, the kind of certainty that only came from having held someone's organs inside a human chest while a medevac waited in the dark. She'd learned that in Helmand Province, not nursing school. "You're good at that," a voice said behind her. Sarah didn't turn. She knew who it was. She always knew. Dr. Marcus Caldwell had a way of moving through the ward like he owned the tiles beneath his shoes. He was 45, maybe, with the kind of expensive haircut that cost more than her weekly groceries and the voice of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Just nursing, doctor," she said quietly, keeping her gaze on the monitor. Heart rate 72. Perfect rhythm. Nothing revealed. Caldwell stepped closer. She felt the air pressure change around him, not like he was important, but like he believed he was. There was a difference. Dangerous people usually weren't sure of themselves. People like Caldwell didn't even know danger existed. "You work too much," he said. 3 shifts last week. That's not healthy. It wasn't concern. She heard the criticism underneath it, the suggestion that she was unstable, that night shift suited her because day shift required normal people with normal lives. She'd learned to hear the architecture of an insult before he even opened his mouth. "The patients need coverage," she said. She turned to face him now, and her eyes were flat as glass. "I'm available." He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "The trauma cases, especially. You have a real touch with them. Almost like you've seen something like this before." She didn't blink. "I read a lot." For 2 seconds, Caldwell studied her with the intensity of someone trying to spot the flaw in a diamond. Then he nodded, and his smile sharpened. "Well, the day shift could use someone like you, but I think you're better suited here. Quieter. Less stress on a sensitive temperament." He walked away before she could respond, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of someone absolutely certain of the ground beneath him. Sarah waited until she heard the stairwell door hiss shut. Then she let her shoulders drop exactly 1 inch, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to feel the tension redistribute through her spine like a sniper adjusting for wind. She went back to her rounds, her gait still perfect, her breathing still level. The mask never slipped in front of witnesses. The locker room was empty at 2:53 a.m. She knew this rhythm. She'd learned when the night shift staff took breaks, when the hallways held the fewest eyes, when she could be alone with the parts of herself she kept in a locker instead of in her chest. She spun the combination, her son David's birthday, March 14th, because some things you never encoded, and pulled open the metal door. The jacket hung exactly where she'd left it. Navy blue, worn at the cuffs, the kind of field jacket that had actually seen fields. She reached for the collar with 2 fingers and traced the inside seam where it was sewn. The unit patch. Faded now, frayed at the edges from being touched too many times by hands that needed something to hold onto. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. Her fingers moved along the embroidered edges like she was reading Braille, like the patch might give her something it hadn't already taken. The same insignia David had worn. The same unit. The same command structure that had sent her 18-year-old boy into a valley 3 years ago and brought back a flag in a cardboard box. She pressed the patch against her palm, held it there for 7 breaths. Her therapist had told her to acknowledge the pain, to sit with it, to let it move through her like weather. Her therapist had never lost a child in an operation she couldn't talk about. Her therapist had never traced a unit insignia at 3 in the morning wondering what commands had been given and which of them had been necessary. The intercom crackled. Static. Then, incoming transfer, ICU bed 7. Colonel Marcus Hayes, disabled veteran, inbound 5 minutes. Sarah's hand froze mid-reach. The patch slipped between her fingers and hung against the jacket lining like a confession. Colonel Marcus Hayes. Not a common name. Not the kind of name that arrived twice in a life. She knew 3 Colonel Hayeses. She'd looked them all up once, 2 years ago, on a night when the insomnia was worse than usual and her phone had the whole internet in it like a weapon. 2 of them had retired to Florida. One of them was at Fort Bragg running logistics. But there was a 4th Hayes. A special one. The one who'd signed the orders for Operation Sangin Valley. The one whose name was at the bottom of the classified briefing that had told her David's unit was going in at 0200 hours to do something that couldn't be discussed at dinner tables or in civilian hospitals where people still believed in the distinction between acceptable losses and unacceptable ones. She moved without deciding to move. Her hands found her badge, her stethoscope, the penlight she carried everywhere. The mask was already in place, the careful, quiet nurse who kept to herself and asked no questions. She'd been wearing it for 18 months. She could keep wearing it for however long this took. The elevator descended 3 floors in 45 seconds. She counted every one. The doors opened on the ICU and she was already moving toward bed 7, already scanning the approach vector, already calculating the trajectories of every person in the room and where they'd move when they realized who was standing in front of them. He came through the doors in a wheelchair, missing his left arm below the elbow. Hair had gone silver at the temples, and his face carried the kind of exhaustion that lived deeper than bone, the kind that came from waking up every morning knowing you'd given a kid an order that came back in a coffin. He wasn't conscious. The paramedics had him on a portable monitor, vitals decent, O2 saturation 94%, heart rhythm regular as a metronome. The transfer nurse, Rodriguez, was reading off the chart. 68-year-old male, traumatic amputation 3 years ago, admitted with acute chest pain, possible arrhythmia, currently stable but requires monitoring. Sarah stopped listening. She was looking at his face, trying to decide if he'd ever actually seen David. If they'd ever stood in a tactical operations center together and looked at satellite imagery of a valley where everything was about to go wrong. If he'd been in the room when someone had said the words, "We're going to lose people on this one." The question was how many we can afford to lose. She moved to the monitor station and plugged in the transfer EKG without speaking. His heart was running a shade too fast for someone at rest. 93 beats per minute. Nothing critical. Just the kind of elevated rate that meant the body remembered trauma even when the brain had learned to live with it. It was when she reached down to adjust his oxygen line that he moved. Not much. Just the slightest shift in his breathing. His eyes flickered open, just a crack, just enough to see the ceiling, just enough to see her standing there with her hand steady as surgical steel and her face arranged in the perfect expression of professional neutrality. She leaned down. She didn't plan to do it. The words just came out, barely above a whisper, a frequency only he could hear over the machines. "Welcome back, sir." His eyes snapped open. Not confused anymore. Alert. Seeing. His pupils dilated as recognition moved through him like electricity, like he'd just understood that the universe was smaller and stranger and more deliberately cruel than he'd ever let himself believe. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out but a breath that sounded like a name. She straightened up. She didn't let her hands tremble. She didn't let her face change. She was just a nurse standing at a bedside in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, on a night shift that had suddenly become something else entirely. She was a ghost watching another ghost realize it was real. Rodriguez was still talking about medications. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their two-note hymn to all the things that happened in the dark when people thought no one was watching. Sarah made a note on the chart. Her handwriting was perfect. Her breathing was perfect. Her composure was perfect. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the look in Colonel Hayes' eyes when he understood who was standing in front of him. The worst part was knowing that this moment, this single moment when a man who'd sent her son into a valley recognized the woman who'd spent 3 years learning how to live in the aftermath, was about to change everything about the careful, invisible life she'd built in the dark. The Colonel's eyes remained locked on hers for 3 seconds after recognition hit. 3 seconds of a man remembering his own hand signing orders. 3 seconds of a woman remembering her son's face in dress uniform. Then the medication pulled him back under, his head tilting against the pillow, and Sarah forced herself to step back from the bedside before her composure fractured entirely. She completed the vital signs check with mechanical precision. Blood pressure 142/88. Heart rate elevated. O2 sat 96%. The numbers were data. Data was safe. Data didn't remind her that the man on this bed had made decisions in a command tent in Helmand Province while her son David waited in the dirt for orders that would change nothing except his obituary. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway at 6:24 a.m. on day 2, his frame silhouetted against the corridor's fluorescent glare. Sarah had learned to sense his presence the way soldiers learn to sense incoming fire, a pressure change in the air, a shift in the room's electromagnetic field. She was adjusting the Colonel's pain management drip, her hand steady as surgical steel, when Caldwell's voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel finding wrong tissue. "Nurse Chen." "Lingering again, I see." She didn't turn. "Pain protocol check, doctor." His last dose was administered 4 hours ago. He was beginning to show signs of discomfort. The Colonel's daughter and son-in-law exchanged glances from the corner chairs where they'd spent the night. Sarah could feel their attention shifting toward her, toward Caldwell, toward the suddenly charged space between them. 12 minutes, Caldwell said, moving into the room with the territorial walk of a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. "I observed you standing at this patient's bedside for exactly 12 minutes last night. Your hand on his shoulder. Speaking to him while he was sedated. That's not care, Nurse Chen. That's projection." The Colonel stirred, his right hand, the one that still existed, moving restlessly across the blanket. His left arm ended at the elbow in clean surgical closure, a line of staples running like Morse code down bandaged flesh. The unit ring on his remaining hand caught the morning light. Same insignia as the patch in her locker. Same insignia as the one her son had worn on a chain around his neck until it came back in a flag-folded box. Sarah maintained her focus on the foredrip, though her peripheral vision had sharpened to tactical acuity. She was aware of Caldwell's proximity, approximately 4 feet, close enough to make a point, far enough to maintain plausible deniability about intimidation. She was aware of the Colonel's daughter leaning forward in her chair, her expression shifting from concern toward confusion. She was aware of her own breathing, which remained perfectly level, the way it had remained level in a forward operating base in Sangin when incoming fire had started, and she'd had to maintain triage protocols while rounds punched through tent canvas. "I was ensuring his medication administration was correctly documented and that his baseline pain level was appropriately managed," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet. That was deliberate. Quiet voices made people strain to listen. Quiet voices commanded rooms without seeming to. Caldwell smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd never encountered resistance that didn't shatter immediately under the right social pressure. "You're too fragile for trauma cases, Nightingale," he said, using the nickname that had circulated through the night shift like contagion. "Maybe pediatrics would be a better fit. Less triggering. More your speed." One tear escaped. Sarah felt it before she saw it in the corner of her vision, a single drop that had absolutely no business appearing on her cheek. Her hands had held bleeding soldiers steady in sandstorm darkness. Her hands had sewn pressure dressings from MRE packaging into chest wounds while a corpsman called for additional units. Her hands did not shake for this man. She wiped the tear away without looking at Caldwell, without acknowledging that she'd seen the small victory bloom across his face like a stain spreading through gauze. The break room that afternoon smelled like stale coffee and the particular antiseptic harshness of a hospital in late summer when the air conditioning worked double time and achieved nothing except recycling everyone's exhaustion through inadequate vents. Sarah sat at the corner table with her lunch, a salad she wouldn't eat, water she would sip methodically while reading the same paragraph of a report 3 times without comprehending it. Jennifer arrived first, then Marcus, then Beth. They saw her. Their eyes met hers for approximately 1 second each, which was approximately 1 second too long. Then, in perfect synchronization that suggested it had been discussed or simply understood through the unspoken network that connected nurses like sonar, they stood. Tray still half full. Mouths closing without words. They left the room with the coordinated precision of soldiers executing a tactical withdrawal. The silence that followed was the specific silence that happens when a person has been visibly abandoned. It wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the sound of professional reputation combusting in real time, and Sarah sat perfectly still in the center of it, one hand wrapped around a water bottle she didn't want, watching the fluorescent lights hum their 3-note funeral dirge on the ceiling. By 6:15 p.m., the write-up had appeared on the unit board in the hallway where every staff member passed at the end of their shift. Boundary violations. Emotional instability. Patient relationship concern. The words were clinical, which made them more cutting than if they'd simply said what Caldwell had meant: she can't be trusted. She's broken. Remove her from proximity to patients who matter. Sarah read it once, her eyes taking in each sentence with the same tactical focus she'd once used to read threat assessments. She didn't feel the rage that would come later, in the parking lot, when she could finally afford to feel anything. Right now, in this moment with her name printed in institutional font for an entire hospital to evaluate and judge, she felt only the specific clarity that came from understanding she was being hunted. Dr. Caldwell was watching from his office window when she turned to find him. She could see the satisfaction radiating off him like heat shimmer off pavement in summer. She walked directly to his door, her steps measured, her breathing controlled, her face arranged in the expression of professional deference that had kept her alive and invisible for 18 months. She opened his door without knocking. "You have no idea what boundaries I've held," she said. The words were quiet. That was what made them land like ordnance. She watched his smile falter for 1/10 of a second, watched his brain try to calculate what that sentence meant, and then she closed his door and returned to her shift as if she'd never been interrupted. 3 days later, the schedule changed. Sarah's name appeared on the pediatric wing assignments. The trauma unit, where the colonel remained, where veteran patients requiring post-surgical care occupied beds with morphine drips and monitoring protocols, became someone else's responsibility. She caught glimpses of him during shift changes, saw his hands trembling more than they had before, saw a nurse's note documenting increased requests for pain management that seemed to go unanswered with the regularity of pattern rather than the randomness of administrative delay. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next was far more calculated, far more competent, far more dangerous than simple humiliation. The schedule change came 3 days after the write-up appeared on the unit board. Sarah stood at the clipboard station reviewing the posted assignments when she saw it. Her name moved from nights, trauma unit, to swing shift, pediatric wing. Then back to nights again. Then pediatrics. The pattern made no sense until it did. Caldwell had been thorough. He'd staggered her hours so completely that she worked opposite shifts from every veteran patient currently admitted to Oak Creek Memorial. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Keep her visible enough to stay employed. Keep her far enough away to be useless. Keep her isolated in a department where she couldn't monitor the colonel's care, where she couldn't ask questions about his declining pain levels, where she couldn't interfere with whatever Caldwell was doing. The next morning, she overheard 2 administrators talking in the hallway outside the break room. Caldwell's voice carried from the office behind them, smooth and measured. "Yes, I understand her credentials are solid, but I have concerns about her emotional stability in trauma cases. I'm recommending we transfer her to the Mercy Clinic satellite location in Chapel Hill. 40 miles away. Night shift only. It would be a fresh start for her, and frankly, for us. Sarah kept walking. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her pace didn't change. But her hands that had held soldiers together on stretchers in Sangin, that had stabilized spines and packed wounds and calculated dosages under fire, her hands curled into fists so tight her nails drew crescents into her palms. 40 miles away meant no interaction with the colonel. No way to observe his care. No way to know if Caldwell was succeeding in whatever he'd started. That night, during the graveyard shift in pediatrics, Sarah was changing a 6-year-old's for when one of the floor nurses mentioned it in passing. You heard about the medication audit, right? Apparently someone's been flagging inconsistencies with opioid dispensing in the trauma unit. Dr. Caldwell said it was probably just documentation errors. Sarah's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. Documentation errors. She'd spent 11 months watching how Caldwell moved through the medication closet, noticing the small things, the way he'd sign out doses for patients and then never chart the administration, the pattern of refusals he'd document for veterans who were clearly in pain, the subtle adjustments to prescriptions that happened only when he was on shift. Pain was information. And what Caldwell's patterns were telling her was unmistakable. He was skimming. High-dose opioids meant for trauma patients, reduced in their prescribed amounts, diverted into his own hands. The audit meant someone had finally noticed. The audit meant the colonel, now alert enough to complain, now aware enough to ask why his post-operative pain medication kept getting cut, represented a threat that Caldwell could not afford. She finished adjusting the child's for and stepped back. The little girl, maybe 7, looked up at her with the kind of trust that children give without reservation. Sarah touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she kept in her locker, the one nobody else knew about. 3 days later, the schedule changed again. An unexpected call at 11 p.m. Chen, we need you on trauma tonight. Graveyard. Understand. She understood perfectly. It was a trap dressed as an assignment. Caldwell had orchestrated this moment with the precision of someone who'd planned it down to the minute. Pull her back into the trauma unit. Give her access to the colonel again. But not as a caregiver, as the scapegoat. She clocked in at 11:02 p.m. and reviewed the board. 17 patients. 2 nurses for graveyard coverage. One of them had called in sick or naturally, which meant Sarah and a first-year resident named Dr. Kumar would cover everything from codes to admissions. The ER was running hot. A multi-vehicle accident had dumped for patients into trauma bays before midnight. Room 347 showed Colonel Hayes stable but resting. His vitals were listed as normal. His pain medication charted as administered. None of it was true. She could tell by the tension in his shoulders, visible even from 30 feet away through the window. At 2:48 a.m., the code alarm screamed from room 347. Sarah was already moving before her brain caught up to her body. The trauma unit, muscle memory, the particular tenor of that alarm, full seizure, not arrest, something neurological, something chemical. She hit the door at a sprint and found the colonel convulsing, his entire frame rigid and shaking, sweat soaking through his hospital gown. His vitals on the monitor told the story better than any chart could: heart rate 156, blood pressure 89/52 and dropping, O2 sat 91 and falling, core temp spiking to 103.2. Dr. Kumar stood frozen beside the bed, pale, first-year resident facing something beyond his training. Page anesthesia, Sarah said, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Get me a 20 cubic centimeters syringe, normal saline, and the medication drawer. Now. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from another life, from field hospitals in Sangin where the choice was protocol or death, and death usually won when you followed protocols. She stabilized his airway, her fingers precise in the darkness, tilting his head, checking for obstruction. His breathing was compromised, aspiration, his body rejecting something, possibly pooled gastric contents from the seizure. She turned him on his side and cleared his airway with practiced efficiency, her hands moving like a trauma surgeon's, like a combat medic's, like someone who'd seen this exact scenario play out in tents lit by chemical lights on the other side of the world. The seizure continued, his body locked in that terrible rigidity. Withdrawal. Acute opioid withdrawal escalating to status epilepticus because someone had reduced his pain medication without taper, without replacement, without any regard for the neurochemical cascade that would follow. What's his last documented dose? She asked Kumar, already knowing the answer wouldn't be helpful. For milligrams morphine at 1600, the resident replied, voice shaking. Sarah calculated. 12 hours ago. Maybe more. The colonel's body had been screaming for those meds for 12 hours, and Caldwell had documented administering them anyway. She pulled a 1 milligram vial of lorazepam and drew it up in a 10 cubic centimeter syringe with methodical precision, the kind of precision that came from having done this under fire, from having had to steady her hands while artillery walked closer. She pushed it for and the seizure began to slow, the colonel's muscles gradually releasing from that terrible locked state. 30 seconds. That was all it took to watch him stop shaking. But his breathing was still compromised. The aspiration risk had compromised his airway, and if his O2 sat continued to fall, they'd need intubation. Sarah looked at the overhead cabinet where the emergency equipment was stored, then at Kumar, then at the colonel's exposed chest where his breathing was becoming shallow, labored. Get me the MRE pouch from his belongings, she said. The one on the chair. Kumar didn't question it. He moved. Sarah opened the lightweight plastic MRE packaging, an improvised chest seal, something she'd jury-rigged from the same materials in combat zones when you had nothing else and time was measured in seconds. She placed it firmly over his compromised airway area, sealing it partially to allow for passive air exchange while containing the aspiration risk. It wasn't standard. It wasn't protocol. It was the kind of move that got people fired in peacetime because peacetime didn't understand that the choice was always between protocol and survival. The colonel's O2 sat stabilized at 94 and climbed. 96, 98. His heart rate began to drop from the mid-150s toward something resembling normal. His body, flooded with benzodiazepines and finally given something resembling pain relief from the drug still in his system, began to stabilize. The seizure had stopped. The immediate crisis had passed. Kumar stared at her, his young face a mix of awe and confusion. Where did you learn? He started, but the door slammed open hard enough to bang against the wall. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway, still in his coat, still in his shoes, the code having pulled him from wherever he'd been waiting. Probably waiting. Probably watching. Probably timing everything perfectly. His eyes moved from the colonel to Sarah to the improvised chest seal to Kumar's awed expression, and Sarah watched his face go through the calculation. This was supposed to be his moment. The colonel was supposed to code. Sarah was supposed to fail. Instead she'd saved him. What the hell do you think you're doing? Caldwell's voice was ice water and razor blades. Sarah stood slowly, her hand still covered in the colonel's blood from the force she'd placed in his radial artery when his peripheral veins had collapsed from shock. One drop of blood hit the floor with the sound of a bell. He was dying from untreated withdrawal, Sarah said. Her voice had changed. It had gone low, precise, the way it sounded when she was giving orders instead of taking them. Someone reduced his pain medication without authorization or taper protocol. His seizure was a direct result. I stabilized his airway and administered emergency intervention to prevent aspiration-induced respiratory failure. Caldwell's face went white, then red, then white again. His hands curled at his sides. You performed procedures outside your scope of practice. You contaminated a sterile field. You overstepped your authority in a manner that constitutes grounds for immediate termination. Clean out your locker. You're done. Security will escort you from the building. He turned to Kumar. Document this as a code managed by Dr. Caldwell with Nurse Chen providing basic assistance. That's all. Kumar's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. But she saved him. Caldwell's look could have frozen blood in a vein. The young doctor went silent. Sarah pulled off her gloves one finger at a time, the latex peeling away to expose her hands. Her hands that had held lives together. Her hands that had done things in Sangin that she'd never speak about, that had kept soldiers breathing on stretchers lit by moonlight, that had known exactly what to do in a crisis because she'd learned in a place where the cost of hesitation was people dying in her arms. The trembling started now, not fear but restraint, the kind of shaking that comes from holding everything down so hard for so long that the pressure itself becomes physical. She looked at the colonel, who was conscious now, his eyes open, his hand reaching out. "Sarah, don't," he whispered, and she touched the ring on his hand once, a brief contact, a transmission of something wordless between people who understood the cost of things. Then she walked out. The hallway fluorescent light seemed impossibly bright after the dimness of the trauma bay, and they hummed their usual mechanical song like nothing had changed, like the entire architecture of her life hadn't just collapsed in a single word. Terminated. Effective immediately. The walk to her locker felt like it took hours. Her scrubs were still wet with blood that wasn't hers. Her hands still knew exactly how to save lives. Her jacket still contained the unit patch, the one piece of her real identity that she'd kept hidden for 18 months, and now none of it mattered. The security guard was already waiting by the employee entrance, professional and impersonal, the kind of security who'd done 100 terminations and would do 100 more. Sarah gathered her things. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't do anything except remove her badge, look at it for 1 second. The photograph showed a woman who looked exhausted but whole, and that woman no longer existed, and hand it to the guard before walking into the Raleigh night where rain had started falling, the kind of rain that hammered like applause or accusation or both. The colonel's monitor flatlined at 2:38 a.m. Sarah was 3 floors down, checking on a pediatric patient with hand-foot-mouth virus when the overhead speaker crackled, "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. She didn't move at first. The pediatric wing was her exile now, her punishment for caring too much. But something in her chest recognized that room number. That was Colonel Marcus Hayes. She was moving before her brain caught up, abandoning the pediatric floor and hitting the stairwell at a run. The door slammed open with a metallic bang that echoed up the concrete shaft. 2 flights. Her left leg protested, the one that had taken shrapnel in Sangin, the one that ached on cold nights and rainy mornings, but pain was information, and the information was clear, someone was dying and she was the only one who knew why. The trauma bay doors burst open. The scene inside moved in slow motion and fast forward simultaneously. Colonel Hayes was convulsing, his body rigid against the bed rails, spittle flecking the corners of his mouth. The night shift nurse, Rodriguez, fresh out of her RN boards, stood frozen beside him, hands shaking. No doctor. No respiratory. Just a kid who'd graduated 6 months ago staring at a human body betraying itself. "Step back," Sarah commanded, not a request, and Rodriguez moved without question because that voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The seizure wasn't hypoxic. It wasn't neurological. It was chemical, the body's screaming plea for medication that had been systematically stolen from him for 2 weeks. Caldwell had reduced the colonel's benzodiazepine dosing by half, then a quarter, then nothing, pocketing the difference in pills that he sold to a pharmaceutical distributor in Chapel Hill for $700 a bottle. Withdrawal from long-term benzodiazepines didn't announce itself gently. It announced itself like this, muscles locked, jaw grinding, the animal brain overriding the civilized one. Sarah's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory was a strange animal, it lived in the tendons and the fast twitch fibers, in the place where conscious thought had no jurisdiction. Her hands had done this before in an aid station outside Kandahar, 2011, when IED fragments had torn through a convoy and left soldiers seizing on blood-stained canvas cots. She knew exactly what her hands were going to do before she consciously decided to do it. "For access," she said, already tying off the colonel's arm with practiced efficiency. The tourniquet went tight, pale blue rubber against brown skin. A 20-gauge angiocath needle slid into the median cubital vein on the first try, the kind of insertion that took most nurses 3 attempts. The hiss of the needle meeting resistance. The flash of blood in the chamber. 2.5 milligrams midazolam 4 push. Now. Rodriguez was standing there, paralyzed, the syringe in her hand trembling so violently she couldn't have injected a medication into a table. Sarah snatched it from her, didn't wait for backup, drew the dose and pushed it directly into the foreport with the smooth precision of someone who had done this under mortar fire. The seizure didn't stop immediately. It took 45 seconds, an eternity in the language of muscle fibers. Sarah's other hand was on the colonel's carotid artery, feeling for the rhythm. His heartbeat was a panicked rabbit trapped in a cage, tachycardic, irregular, the electrical system of his body running on fear and pharmaceutical absence. Get me a bear hugger. Now. His core temp is dropping. Rodriguez was already moving, understanding without explanation that this woman didn't ask questions twice. The warming blanket unrolled like a tent over the colonel's body. Sarah had one hand checking pupil response, equal, round, reactive, thank God, and the other adjusting the foreflow rate. The seizure began to release, muscle by muscle, the convulsion smoothing into shudders, then into stillness. His breathing was ragged. Shallow. The kind of breathing that came after the body had been wrung out like wet cloth. Oxygen saturation? Sarah asked, though she could read the monitor herself. She already knew it was low. Somewhere around 88%. In a civilian nurse, that might trigger panic. In Sarah, it triggered precision. She was already pulling the oxygen mask from the wall mount, the motion fluid and economical. 92, Rodriguez whispered. It's climbing. 95. 97. The colonel's eyes fluttered. Not open, not yet. But aware. The small muscle twitch at the corner of his mouth that meant consciousness was crawling back toward the surface. Sarah straightened up, oxygen mask now secure, the colonel's vital signs stabilizing into something that resembled survival. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, for sinus pattern, beautiful and alive. Her hands were steady as the surgical laser they'd always been, even though her heart was moving at a speed that would have violated several laws of physics. That was when Dr. Caldwell walked in. He stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, taking in the scene, the colonel breathing normally, the 4 in place, the warming blanket, Rodriguez looking at Sarah with an expression that was halfway between awe and terror, and Sarah herself standing at the bedside with her hand still positioned over the colonel's chest, the picture of someone who absolutely knew what she was doing. What the hell are you doing? Caldwell's voice was ice, but it was the thin ice that cracks before it breaks. Sarah turned to face him. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no emotion at all. Stabilizing a patient in withdrawal. He's been cut off cold from his benzodiazepines. 48-hour taper minimum, not whatever this is. You're not authorized to make medication decisions, Caldwell said, stepping into the room. His face was flushing, the capillaries blooming red across his cheekbones. You're not even supposed to be on this floor. You're pediatrics now, Chen. Pediatrics. A patient coded. I responded. You overstepped your authority. Again. He was pointing at her now, the gesture theatrical and vicious. This is exactly the kind of boundary violation we discussed. You don't get to decide what patients receive. You don't get to make clinical judgments. You're a floor nurse. You follow orders. The room was absolutely silent. Even the machines seemed to pause between beeps, holding their breath. Rodriguez had placed herself near the door, as if proximity to an exit might protect her from the violence of the moment. Sarah said nothing. She looked at Caldwell with an expression so calm it should have come with a weather forecast. She was thinking about David. She was thinking about the 3 years since that IED took him and the unit patch in her jacket lining and the version of herself that had died in Sangin and been pretending to be a civilian ever since. She was thinking about how the truth was going to come out and how when it did, men like Caldwell would understand that they had been playing a child's game in a room full of wolves. "You're fired," Caldwell said. "As of right now. Effective immediately. You're terminated for practicing outside your scope of practice, for insubordination, and for gross breach of protocol. Remove your badge and your access card and exit the building. Now." Sarah reached up and unhooked her badge from her scrub pocket. The laminated photograph stared up at her. Sarah Chen, RN, BSN, taken during orientation 18 months ago. In the photo she looked competent. Exhausted, but whole. That woman no longer existed. She handed it to Rodriguez. "Tell him he's going to need 50 milligrams of phenobarbital per day, divided doses, for the next 2 weeks. Then taper by 10 milligrams every 3 days. And monitor his liver function. The diversion pattern suggests he's been selling high-dose opioids for months." "That's not your problem anymore," Caldwell spat. "Get out." Sarah turned to the colonel. His eyes were open now, clear, fixed on her face with the intensity of someone who recognized something ancient underneath the scrubs. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. She walked out of the trauma bay, down the corridor, past the night shift station where 3 nurses pretended to be very absorbed in their computers, past the elevator bank, past the security desk where she handed her access card to a guard who looked embarrassed for her. She didn't speak. She didn't do anything except remove her badge, look at it for 1 second. The photograph showed a woman who looked exhausted but whole, and that woman no longer existed, and hand it to the guard before walking into the Raleigh night where rain had started falling, the kind of rain that hammered like applause or accusation or both. Her hands didn't shake until she reached her car. She drove through the downpour with visibility down to nothing, the wipers batting uselessly against the flood. The radio played something inconsequential about love and loss. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her hair dripped. She couldn't feel the difference between the rain and her own tears, and so she stopped trying to distinguish between them. Oakwood Cemetery sat on a rise overlooking the city, the kind of place that reeked of permanence and ending. She parked and walked through the downpour until she found the headstone she'd been avoiding for 3 years, David Michael Chen, Specialist, United States Army, beloved son. The dates bracketed a life that had run from 1998 to 2021. She collapsed to her knees in the mud. The words came in broken whispers, pulled from somewhere deeper than breath. "I found him, David. I found Colonel Hayes. The man who led you into that valley 3 years ago. The man who sent you on your final mission." Her voice cracked like old leather. "And I couldn't even protect him. Caldwell was stealing their medication. Starving them of their own prescriptions. And I couldn't stop it. I failed you. I failed your father." She clutched the nursing badge in her trembling hand, the lamination cutting small lines into her palm. The rain soaked through to her skin, ice-cold and unforgiving. She stayed there until the rain stopped, until the sun began to rise over Raleigh in shades of grey and purple, until she had nothing left to say to the dead. Then she drove home to tell her 16-year-old son, also named Marcus, that she'd lost her job and she didn't know what came next. When she opened the front door, Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, the attic access visible on the screen. He looked up with an expression she'd never seen before, determination mixed with something that looked like pride. He was holding the shadow box that contained the medals she kept hidden behind the insulation on the east wall. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know about the hearing tomorrow. I know what Caldwell did. And I know what you haven't told them." He stood and walked to her. "I went into the attic." Rain hammered the windshield like machine gun fire as Sarah drove through Raleigh at 2:48 a.m., her hand steady on the wheel but her jaw clenched so tight she could taste blood. The nursing badge still hung from her scrubs, Oak Creek Memorial clipped above her heart like evidence of a crime she'd committed by simply trying to save a life. The roads were empty except for the occasional late-night delivery truck, headlights blurring in the downpour. She took the exit toward Oakwood Cemetery without thinking, her body remembering the route her mind had spent 3 years trying to forget. The gate hung open as it always did. She parked near the entrance, killed the engine, and stepped into rain that fell so hard it felt personal. Her scrubs were soaked through within seconds. She didn't care. She walked past the headstones, some old enough that moss covered the dates, some so new the grass hadn't grown back, until she reached the section where the military markers stood in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. Granite. White. Simple. Unforgiving. David Chen, 2002 to 2021. Sergeant, United States Army Special Forces. Beloved son. Loving brother. The headstone didn't mention the 3 tours before he was 20. Didn't mention that he wore a unit ring identical to the one Colonel Hayes had pressed into her palm. Didn't mention that he'd come home in a flag-draped box after a valley in Sangin that Sarah had only read about in the classified briefing materials she'd memorized and then burned because her hands weren't supposed to know what they knew anymore. She knelt in the mud. Her nursing badge swung forward, catching on the wet fabric of her scrubs. She held it between her palms like it might shatter, this small rectangle of plastic that said she was competent, trustworthy, qualified to hold lives in her hands. Dr. Caldwell had ripped it from her as easily as tearing paper. One moment of truth, her hands moving with muscle memory, saving Colonel Hayes from death by withdrawal, and 18 months of silence had evaporated like morning mist. I found the man who led David into that valley, she whispered to the headstone, her voice barely audible beneath the rain. And I couldn't even protect him. I failed you both. The rain ran down her face, but she wasn't crying. She'd learned years ago that tears and survival don't share the same body. You choose one or the other. She'd chosen survival so many times that her tear ducts had finally understood and surrendered. The headlights appeared without warning, cutting through the downpour, sweeping across the cemetery like a searchlight. Sarah didn't move. She heard the car door open, heard footsteps running, heard the particular rhythm of a child trying not to slip in mud. Then a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat. Mom. Marcus was 16, tall enough now that she had to look up to him, dressed in a hoodie that clung to his shoulders. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered against his forehead, and he was carrying something that caught the ambient light from the cemetery lamps, a shadow box, the kind funeral homes sold, the kind that held medals and ribbons. What are you doing here? Sarah's voice didn't waver, but her hands did. Just slightly. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the exhausting work of holding back everything that wanted to pour out. You left your laptop open, Marcus said. He wasn't apologizing. He was explaining, the way she'd taught him to do when the words mattered. The hospital board meeting. Monday morning. The respondents' table. I read the email from your union rep. He stepped closer, breathing hard from the run. I went into the attic. Like you told me, the box marked medical supplies. Dad's box. David's things. Sarah's hands went to fists. Mom, they need to see these, Marcus said. He held out the shadow box and she could read the labels through the glass, could see the ribbons arranged in precise order, the careful preservation of a life she'd spent 17 years burying. The silver star. The bronze star with Valor. The purple hearts. The Defense Superior Service Medal with the security clearance notation nobody's supposed to see, but it's right there, embossed on the ribbon. Marcus, no. You got terminated for saving someone's life, he said. His voice had his father's steel underneath it, the same immovable logic. You saved Colonel Hayes. And they fired you for it. Because that guy has been stealing medicine from his patients. And the only person who knows he's stealing is the nurse he just got rid of. Marcus held the shadow box higher. These prove you know how to save people. That you've been trained to save people. That you spent your entire adult life training to save people. And then you became a nurse because saving people is the only thing you know how to do. Sarah stood, her legs stiff from kneeling in mud. The rain fell between them but didn't touch her son, didn't touch the shadow box he held like an offering. The board hearing is in 5 hours, Marcus said. They're going to listen to Dr. Caldwell's side of the story. They're going to hear about boundary violations and inappropriate attachments. And they're going to believe him because he wears a tie and has a medical license, and you let them believe you're nobody. He lowered the box slightly, meeting her eyes. But you're not nobody. You're Major Sarah Chen, United States Army Special Forces. You're the nurse who saved a man's life using skills that took the Department of Defense $100,000 and 5 years to teach you. They need to see that. The board needs to see that. Everyone who treated you like you were disposable needs to see that. Sarah's jaw unclenched. The rain kept falling. Somewhere in the cemetery, water dripped from a marble angel's wings. "We'll go together," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Monday morning. Before the hearing. You'll shower. You'll change. You'll sit at that respondent's table in your worn scrubs if that's what you want, because worn scrubs are battle armor. And I'll walk in with this box, and I'll put it on the table in front of everyone, and the first person who sees that silver star is going to understand that they've been looking at a hero the whole time and just didn't know it. Sarah took the shadow box from her son's hands. It was heavier than it should have been, not the weight of metal and ribbon, but the weight of 17 years held at arm's length, finally being asked to come home. Monday morning arrived grey and cold. Sarah sat alone at the respondent's table in her worn scrubs, her shoes still slightly damp from the cemetery, her fingers folded on the table in front of her. The conference room was sterile, white walls, recessed lighting, a long mahogany table where the hospital board sat in their pressed suits and comfortable certainty. Dr. Caldwell's attorney occupied a seat 3 chairs down, looking confident. Caldwell himself sat beside her, his expression carefully neutral, his fingers drumming against a folder containing personnel evaluations and boundary violation write-ups and emails highlighting Sarah's emotional attachment to the patient. The board administrator called the hearing to order at 9:03 a.m. A recording device was activated, red light, steady, documenting everything. Caldwell's attorney began laying out the case with precision, Sarah's inappropriate lingering at patient bedsides, her visible emotional reaction to Colonel Hayes, her violation of scope of practice when she performed medical intervention without authorization. The narrative was clean. It made sense. It was the story of a nurse who'd gotten too close to her work and needed to be removed for everyone's safety. Sarah didn't blink. She didn't react. She let the lie sit in the air like cigarette smoke. The board administrator was beginning to speak when the conference room door opened and Marcus walked in, soaked again, this time not from rain but from running up 3 flights of stairs. The shadow box was held in front of him like a shield and a weapon both. "They need to see these," he said. His voice was steady. His 16-year-old voice, unshaking, carrying the same authority his sister had carried on her final mission. He placed the shadow box on the table in front of the board. The administrator's hand trembled as she picked it up. She stared at the medals for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then she began to read the citation embossed on the backing plate. Major Sarah Chen, United States Army Special Forces. A nurse in the back row gasped. Sarah heard the rapid tap-tap-tap of fingers on a tablet, someone pulling up records, Sarah's actual service record, the classified portion suddenly visible with 3 paragraphs of redacted commendations that nobody at Oak Creek Memorial had ever seen because Sarah had never mentioned them. The conference room door opened again. This time it wasn't a child or a ghost. It was Colonel Marcus Hayes, wheeled in by 2 men in dark suits who positioned him at the head of the mahogany table. His uniform was dress blue with decorations that made generals look like interns. His single remaining arm held a small leather box. He looked directly at Dr. Caldwell as he began to speak. "The Bronze Star with Valor for Sangin," Hayes said, his voice like a tank idling in a graveyard. "The Purple Heart. Second one here." He opened the leather box. "The Defense Superior Service Medal for operations I still can't talk about." He pulled out an identical ring, gold, engraved with unit insignia, worn smooth from years of a man's devotion to brothers who'd served beside him. "And this? My military ring. The twin to the one her son wore when he died under my command in the valley she should have been in." "Not him." The board administrator set down the shadow box. She was crying now, silently, her professional composure shattered like an aneurysm. "She saved my life," Hayes said. "On that graveyard shift. With skills that no civilian nurse should possess. with knowledge that comes from training, from experience, from 17 years of service to the people around her. The question isn't whether she overstepped. The question is why anyone ever thought they had the right to ask her to step down. The door opened a third time. This time it wasn't someone Sarah knew. Two men in navy windbreakers with FBI lettering across the chest. The older one was Hispanic, mid-50s, his eyes carrying the weight of cases solved in parking lots and evidence rooms. He looked at Dr. Caldwell the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. "Dr. Marcus Caldwell," he said. "You're under arrest for federal prescription fraud, systematic medication diversion across 3 registered facilities, falsification of medical records, and obstruction of a federal investigation." He pulled out handcuffs that looked like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." Caldwell's attorney was already trying to negotiate, but the FBI agent, his name tag read Torres, was stone-faced. "Save it for the federal prosecutor," he said. They moved him through the door, and as they did, it opened onto a hallway lined with staff. Nurses Sarah had worked beside for 18 months. Orderlies who'd seen her in the break room while everyone else left. Residents who'd watched her accept humiliation with the kind of quiet grace that only comes from having already survived worse. They didn't applaud. They didn't cheer. They just stood there, hundreds of eyes watching Dr. Caldwell walk past the nurses' station where he'd orchestrated her exile, past the trauma ward where he'd quietly tortured veterans for their pain medication, past the symbol of competence and healing that he'd spent weeks trying to destroy. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The hospital administrator held an emergency staff meeting within the hour. Sarah was reinstated immediately with back pay and offered her choice of positions. She asked for time to think, and in that time, the investigation expanded like wildfire. Federal auditors descended on Oak Creek Memorial, pulling records for every patient under Caldwell's care for the past 3 years. They found 19 veterans whose pain medication was systematically reduced. 19 people whose suffering was dismissed as drug-seeking behavior. For who'd filed complaints that were buried in his desk drawer. 2 who'd transferred to other facilities. 1 who'd died, ruled a suicide, but now under federal review. The depth of Caldwell's betrayal spread through the medical community like sepsis through a bloodstream. His medical license was suspended pending trial. His practice was dissolved within a week. His colleagues deleted photos, scrubbed references, became strangers to the man they'd worked beside for a decade. Sarah left the board hearing with her son and Colonel Hayes. Marcus drove while Sarah sat in the passenger seat, the shadow box in her lap. She didn't speak for the entire ride. Hayes sat in the back, one hand resting on the window, watching Raleigh pass by. At the cemetery gates, Sarah asked Marcus to wait in the car. She carried the shadow box to her husband's grave and placed it against the headstone, the glass catching the afternoon light. "I found him," she whispered. "And I protected him. I kept my promise." The ring Colonel Hayes had given her was still in her pocket. She pulled it out, gold, engraved with insignia that matched the one David had died wearing, the one Colonel Hayes had carried through 17 years of command decisions and survivor's guilt. She held it up to the light, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself remember her son's face without pain fracturing her composure. The ring would go into a shadow box eventually. But not today. Today it would go into her pocket, pressed against her heart, a reminder that sometimes the quietest people are the ones holding it all together. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of, if you've ever held a secret that could change everything, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Your silence doesn't make you weak, it makes you dangerous. Let me know in the comments, would you have revealed yourself, or would you have kept walking in the rain? And if you believe in second chances, share this with someone who deserves one.